Hello and welcome to Have We Got Planning News for You. Thank you very much indeed for those of us watching live and our online viewers on YouTube, Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Please don't forget to make a charity donation in lieu of registration fee. You can find out the range of charities we support on our website, havewegotplanningNewsForYou.com, or of course feel free to make a donation to a local charity of your choice. My name is Charlie Banner of Keating Chambers and I'm delighted to welcome to the show the first Olympic gold medalist we've ever had, former wearer of the yellow jersey, chair of Sport England, Chris Boardman OBE. Chris, welcome. Very nice to have you on the show. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Good evening. Thank you very much for having me.
Great to have you here. Just ask, where are you calling us from? And what have you chosen our
Principality? I'm in the Principality of Wirral at the moment, where I've got 6 kids, 3 grandkids, so we've largely inhabited the entire peninsula and thinking of taking it over.
Very nice indeed. Well, we're delighted to have you on the show, and Thea's going to be interviewing you in the second half of the show. Though, if there's anything that you would like to comment on as we go along before we get to the interview, please do. I've even got a case about active travel, so there you go. That's very timely. Well done, Sasha, script writer extraordinaire. Now let's go to our panelists. Starting, Thea, with you. How are you?
Hello, I'm very well, thank you, Charlie. I am in Harrogate this evening. Bit of a controversy about whether it's Harrogate or Harrogate. Paul?
Harrogate.
Harrogate. Yeah, the guys on the front desk are arguing about it. It hasn't been resolved, but that's where I am this evening. You didn't ask Chris about his theme.
I didn't. I thought I'd leave that to you.
Oh, so Chris, your theme, tell us all about it.
Well, my theme, topically, because of you're asking about my location at the moment, is the Cairngorms, where I spend about a third of the year. And so I thought that was as good a theme as any. I'll be heading there in the next couple of days.
It's a great theme and a great place. And I have done nothing for the theme because I've been on the road travelling, so I can only apologise for that. But in honour of your appearance on our show, thank you very much for coming along, Chris. We're really thrilled to have you. I have worn my cycling club jersey.
I can see that.
Yeah. And it's not coming off for the next hour.
Your clients put you up in much nicer hotels than my clients do, Thea. Yeah. Hey, you clearly charged.
You've got a low bar, Charlie. This is fantastic.
It looks very nice to me. Tora, good evening. How are you?
Good evening, Charlie. I'm very well, thank you. I am joining from Norfolk, where it is half term. I was very pleased about the theme because I was actually up in the Cairngorms 3 weeks ago for some fishing, just north of the Cairngorms. And while I was there, I bought myself some Macallan whiskey. So I've taken the opportunity to pour myself a dram this evening in honour of the theme.
That is a superb whiskey. Happy drinking. No, I thought I'd be abstemious and have some green tea. I was going to want something to drink, but there we are. Chris, how are you? Very nice to see you.
I'm very well. I'm in a very good mood because we're in the final week of the Sittingbourne inquiry. It's been going for 14, 15 weeks. I've done my closing submissions. It's all done. I am in ecstatic mood. I love the Cairngorms, but I've got absolutely nothing to show for the theme. Sorry.
And Sasha, our resident Scot.
Yes, thank you. I'm wearing my Six Nations top in honour of Chris and the Cairngorms, and he'll be pleased to know I cycled through the Cairngorms on my way from Land's End to John O'Groats in August. So
Not done that one. New list.
Well, I'm not going to be ridiculous and give you cycling tips, but I heavily commend it, frankly.
You've done it twice, Sasha. Why didn't you take Chris for the hat trick?
Well, maybe, but I'd be a bit worried if he could keep up with me.
Can I join that trip if we get? That's arranged now, isn't it?
That's done, locked and loaded. And Paul, very nice to see you.
Well, I've gone the extra mile. I'm in the Glen Eagles Hotel, not the Glen Eagles Hotel actually, but the Glen Eagles Townhouse in Edinburgh. Because my wife's flying out to Berlin tomorrow, and they've very kindly brought me some Balvenie whiskey up. So I'll have a dram of that before I hop on the train and head back to Newcastle and allow her to enjoy the delights of this place. So, Chris, thank you so much for coming on.
Why have you gone to Edinburgh in order to go to Berlin? It seems a rather circuitous.
Because they just cancelled the flights from Newcastle directly to Berlin, and Edinburgh is the next nearest airport. It's the north. It's the north of Britain, Charlie. I'll explain it to you one day.
Yeah,
And you can
perhaps
north
you
of
won't
what-
know. Some bits beyond me. Anyway, enough of that, and we're going to go straight into the news, the planning news, and over to Sasha to tell us what's been happening since our last show.
Thank you, Charlie. Yes, I'm going to, first of all, I'm going to give the best advert for the planning bar in the history of mankind, and that is the Planning Inspectorate have released their latest figures. And for those who wish to get planning consent at appeal, the figures show that there is now remarkably a 76% rate of success at inquiries. So basically 3 or 4 appeals that are determined by the public inquiry route get permission. That's in contrast to hearings at 59% and written reps at 29%. So for all our clients out there, when we advocate the inquiry route procedure, we're not just thinking about our stays at the townhouse in Edinburgh, at the Gleneagles townhouse, but we are thinking about your own interests. So that's the first point. The second point I wanted to talk about was government changes to Ramsar sites, and that is proposed changes to increase the EU law coverage on Ramsar sites, which is raising concern in the development industry. And this week, the HBF and the LDPF wrote to the government, in particular Rachel Reeves, to raise their concerns on that. So watch that space. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about housing delivery in London. And the Secretary of State has shown an interest in what he believes is a failure to have enough housing coming forward in London and a potential relaxation on the affordable housing requirement, and also seeking to speed up the process. So again, watch how that is implemented in practice. The next issue is interesting. I didn't actually know it existed, but the Secretary of State for Energy, one of Thea's great personal friends, has just released a carbon budget 2025. And it's quite interesting what's happened. Since July 24, there has been £50 billion invested in renewable energy projects, which is quite remarkable. And there is an expectation of the government by 2030 that 800,000 people will work in that sector. And frankly, the net zero economy is growing 3 times faster than the rest of the economy. So that's quite interesting. Fifthly, I'm going to talk about water pollution. The government have got a consultation. All of those who are watching who are interested in water pollution, the government have got a consultation out which is talking about a proposed significant increase in the penalties that can be imposed on the water companies, including a proposal for up to £500,000 fines for breaches of environmental regulations. So anyone who's particularly interested in that, do respond to the government's consultation. Sixthly, electric vehicle charging points. Interesting point. I'm going to test Chris potentially. How many public electric vehicle charging points are there in the UK currently?
Oh,
About
I'm going to say, Charlie, you know, he's been promoting them. I don't know, 10,000.
Thousandly built, about 5.
No, I was actually meaning Chris B, but then I thought it was there. I didn't want to do the test, which government ministers get embarrassed when they're asked how much does a pint of milk cost. But if Chris B is willing to give a view, are you willing to have a guess how many public electric vehicle charging points there are?
I would guess at a very low number, about 10,000.
Slightly higher, 86,000. But frankly, I'll agree with you. If you think about the whole of the UK, population of 65 million, and the number of vehicles, that's not very many public charging points. So the government is going to try and make it easier for house owners, particularly, remember all those trips that you to make it easier for the planning system, not require planning permission for the provision. Seventhly, it's quite a remarkable week because Tora might have passed through it on her way to Norfolk. The first station on the Great Eastern Main Line opened this week. 100 years since the station opened on that route, and that was opened at Bewley Park. And lastly, decline of buses. There are statistics by the Department of Transport released that there have been 300 million fewer miles by buses on the British roads in 2010 compared to 2024. So that's pretty salutary of how the decline of bus use in the past 14 years. So, Charlie, that is the news items of this week.
Thank you very much indeed, Sasha. Well, there was some long-rated, very good news, much anticipated last week. Bon Jovi have announced their first tour since 2022. And it was 2022 when CG Fire and Son applied to discharge conditions on a reserved matters application to a permission granted in 2015. And 3 and a bit years later, they've finally been vindicated. And Paul's going to tell us about that.
Well, so you've already told the dates, Charlie. Sasha's already told about the legislation that changed it. So I'm left with the rump of the case to explain. So I'm giving the Supreme Court case, and I've got virtually nothing left to say. Charlie sort of won and sort of lost. That's about it. Do you want more? So this is a case which was handed down on the 22nd of October. It was where the lead judgment was given by Lord Sales. There were 2 issues. And it all goes, one's a general application and one's of comparatively limited application, depending on what happens to the lobbying of the Home Builders Federation. But back in 2015, I think that was about 8 prime ministers ago, Messrs. Fry and Co. were granted outline planning permission for 650 homes as part of a mixed-use scheme down in Somerset. And in 2020, they received reserved matters approval for 190 homes. In August 2020, Natural England wrote to Somerset Council, who granted the permissions, saying there are now concern about adverse effects of phosphates on the Somerset Levels and Moors Ramsar site caused by foul water from new development, and asked for an appropriate assessment of the habitats rates for all new projects that could contribute to that effect. I should say Ramsar, we say the word all the time in our world, but it's actually a small beach resort in Iran, and in 1971 it was one of the most desirable places to go to. Apparently lots of the infrastructure is still there, but anyway, back to what happens in Somerset. In December 2021, Messrs. Fry and Co. applied to discharge pre-commencement conditions on the reserve matters, but the council said no chance in the light of the Natural England letter. They required an appropriate assessment. Having refused the application to discharge the condition, there was an appeal. That appeal failed. There was then a challenge against that decision in November of 2022. I think we're about 5 prime ministers ago now. June 2023, the High Court rejected that challenge under Section 288. A lengthy and entertaining judgment by Sir Ross Cranston. I think it's on Charlie's wall. The appeal against that then went to the Court of Appeal, where Lord Justice Lindblom shook his head in a slightly rumpy way towards Charlie, saying no chance. So he failed in relation to that one. And then it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. The question then therefore centers upon the need for appropriate assessments and the application of the habitats regs, and in relation to discharge of condition stage. I'll deal with the second issue first, because that's the one that Charlie won on, and he's promised me that I'm going to get a lot more of this if I start with the second point first. The second point was that the High Court and the Court of Appeal were found by the Supreme Court to have erred in giving a statement of policy in what was then paragraph 181 of MPPF, but is now 194 of MPPF, the same status and importing into it the same test as you would have in law for a habitat reg site. This was a site which was a Ramsar site, but not a habitat reg site. And the court said, no, you shouldn't be doing that. For a Ramsar site, you should not be derogating from the grant of planning permission in that regard, which is conventional jurisprudence. And essentially, the decision had been taken by that stage. And what one couldn't do was then use the discharge of conditions for the motive of trying to weave in an appropriate assessment by the back door. So the point has been fixed by that stage. The first issue is the one which is of general application and relates to whether or not Regulation 63 of the Habitats Regs applies at a discharge of conditions stage and also reserved matter stage, or whether it's just the in principle stage. And the court had no difficulty in following what the Court of Appeal and the High Court had said in saying, no, the language of Regulation 63 is quite general, and one should interpret it with a purposive sense in terms of what you're trying to do, i.e. protect vulnerable ecology, and you apply the precautionary principle, so that the court said, no, it was very clear in their judgment that Regulation 63 did apply at all stages of a multi-stage consent. So the news from this on the issue one is that, and it's paragraph 69 of the judgment for anyone who wants to read it, is the old age-old principle of not derogating from the grant of an outline permission at later stages. That's the one that I'll be throwing into advices in the future. But in relation to issue one, the issue about the application, the habitats race to multi-stage consent, the court said no, agreed with the two courts below, and it applies even down to discharge of conditions. Important case, interesting case, and as I understand it from some intelligence from somebody who might be on the call or may not be on the call, the issue of costs is still a live one as between the appellant and the respondent. So I look forward to seeing what that judgment is going to be.
Well, certainly there's a big call this one.
And let's see if Charlie can resist the temptation to keep smiling for the next half an hour, or indeed say anything at all about it.
Well, the Supreme Court's order, the appeals are allowed, decisions quashed, and the claim is allowed. So I think it's fairly clear who won that one.
Bon Jovi.
Anyway, we'll see the vote on the Ramsar amendments. The planning infrastructure bill is Monday afternoon, so it'll be interesting to see what happens there. Now, Chris, you're going to tell us about a decision in a place that is either called Hynot or Hynot, and I have no idea how it's pronounced, but hopefully you will.
Yes, well, it's actually about a challenge to the Hynot cluster. And Hynot was the name the claimants gave themselves. They were a collection of organisations like Friends of the Earth who were opposed to this particular proposal. So this is a judicial review claim. The case concerned a challenge to the carbon capture and storage, CCS, development under the Irish Sea. CCS is a process whereby emissions are captured before reaching the atmosphere and redirected to depleted reservoirs or aquifers to be stored. The government regards this as a necessity and not an option for the pathway to net zero. And the proposed infrastructural development is of national significance insofar as it's viewed as critical to achieving net zero. The claimant was a company limited by guarantee, and they called themselves Hynot as a sort of play on words. But it was, as I say, a collection of organisations that were opposed to this. And they're not opposed, obviously, to net zero, but what they're opposed to is trying to find technology to resolve this issue. And they see that as a distraction from the need to focus on removing all carbon emitting processes. They opposed the Hynot cluster, which includes infrastructure for both the transport and capture of carbon dioxide and the production and transport of hydrogen by underground pipelines and storage. And the claim sought permission to bring the judicial review proceedings against the decision of the government. It was only at the application stage, but the judge heard very extensive arguments over various issues, largely about what the Secretary of State failed to take into account and what else should have been taken into account. The specific decision under challenge was the Secretary of State's decision to grant consent for storage permit applications under the development under the offshore oil and gas exploration, production, unloading and storage environmental impact assessment regulations, of which in my house we talk of little else. It was only the decision about the transport and capture of the carbon dioxide that was under challenge. Claimant advanced 3 grounds. I'm just going to focus on the first one. They submitted that there wasn't sufficient assessment by the government, by the Secretary of State, of the risks from major accidents and disasters, which has the fabulous acronym MAD. So there wasn't enough assessment of MAD as proposed by the developments. And in addition, they said on ground 1, there was insufficient consultation with the public as to those MAD risks. The claimant suggested that the Secretary of State failed to properly assess the cumulative effects of the development on climate change. And thirdly, they argued that there'd been a failure to consider the habitats regulations by failing to provide cogent reasons for rejecting the advice of 2 expert statutory nature consultation bodies. Now, on ground 1, it was argued no proper assessment of the MAD risks had taken place in the environmental statement, and there was insufficient information gathered about the risks and the mitigation and what was relied upon to try and reach what's called the as low as reasonable possible standard. Schedule 6 of the offshore EIA regulation sets out the obligation to include assessment of the likely significant effects of the proposal on the environment. And that requires a description of the mitigation measures The judge relied on the case of the Crown and Gathercole, Suffolk County Council, that decisions relating to the inclusion of information in the environmental statement and the nature and the level of the detail included are within the exclusive jurisdiction of the Secretary of State to decide as to the matters of his judgment, and that following the Crown and Suffolk Energy Action Solutions, the level of information included in the ES should be judged as a whole. The decision of what was sufficient to include in that assessment of the mitigation of the risks was therefore a subjective one, subject only to what we lawyers call Wensbury unreasonable review. And it was thought that Finch, the Supreme Court case in Finch, had not altered those principles, remembering that Lord Leggett in the Supreme Court recognised that generally the scope of an environmental impact assessment is one of evaluative judgment, and the court will not interfere unless the decision is irrational. The judge noted that the MAD risks had been considered in the EIA process, and there was no obligation under the Secretary of State to assess all the MAD risks. It was a matter of judgment for the Secretary of State what MAD risks to scope out. So a different context, but just reiterating really principles that we're all familiar with. The claimant also argued the risks of MAD should have been assessed cumulatively along with wider projects. Now, this does engage Finch, and in particular the issue about when you look at downstream effects and whether they have a direct consequence. And remember, the Supreme Court had said that determining the downstream emissions are an inevitable result of oil extraction if there's causation, and you should look at the downstream effects of the consequences of extracting oil. But in this case, the judge said that didn't apply. The principle in Finch didn't apply. More particularly, the judge concluded that any attempt to identify the cumulative risks of the wider project, so this carbon capture project, and I quote, would require an exercise going beyond even speculation and conjecture. So limiting the extent to which Finch applies in the circumstances of this case. There were also arguments about an unlawful paper chase. We're all familiar with that from the Barclay case in 2001, but the judge rejected those as well. And incidentally, the judge said the claim, if he had to decide it, the claim would have been rejected anyway because it hadn't been brought promptly. It was issued on the last day of the judicial review window from the date of the actual decision, albeit only 8 weeks after the decision was published. But the claimants only issued protective proceedings, and the judge took all that into account and said it wouldn't have been prompt if he'd considered that issue, but he dealt with the substance of the case. I mean, there's some really technical arguments in there, and well done to everybody involved, but ultimately the claim is dismissed.
Thank you very much, Chris. And straight to Kent and a solar scheme that Tori will tell us about.
Thanks, Charlie. Yes, I'm going to talk about the grant of development consent for the Stone Street Green solar farm in Kent. So a very large solar farm, 474 acres, which hit the BBC about a week ago, included battery storage and a grid connection. The examining authority was just one inspector who recommended consent was granted, and the Secretary of State agreed. The issues were pretty standard for any large solar scheme. They included principle of development, biodiversity, heritage, landscape visual, noise, socioeconomics, etc. But why is this decision interesting or helpful? Well, I think there are 2 points that I want to draw out. The first is the strong statements in the decision letter in support of the need for the development and its climate credentials. So the Secretary of State at paragraph 4.6 concluded that the combination of the urgent need for the proposed development and beneficial impacts on climate change bring very great weight for the making of the order. There was agreement with the examining authority's view on the need for the development and the contribution that it would make to need and targets for low carbon and renewable energy generation, which attracted substantial positive weight. What was interesting, though, is actually in the very next paragraph, 4.7, the Secretary of State noted that the examining authority had given additional weight to net reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So they'd given need one lot of weight, and then the need to reduce GHG emissions, another lot of weight. But the Secretary of State said actually those are really the same thing, and considered them together and gave substantial positive weight to two of those, probably to avoid criticism of double counting. So that's helpful. I think if you are promoting renewable energy development, again, it's not terribly surprising in light of all the other decisions that there have been on this type of development. The second reason I think is even more interesting, which is the politics surrounding this decision. So a few days after this decision came out, the BBC reported that the council quit solar talks after shifting on climate. And what this relates to is the fact that Kent County Council is controlled by Reform. So Reform came in the local elections in May. And on the 18th of September this year, they rescinded the council's declaration of a climate emergency, which had been made in 2019. And their resolution was to be open-minded but sceptical of anthropogenic climate change. And they then discussed Reform's proposal for a strategic statement to resist government plans to cover agricultural land and solar farms. So, and what's happened here is that the council have apparently, according to the BBC, walked away from discussions with the developer over the right to use council land for their cables to connect to the grid. So what that demonstrates quite starkly is the very divergent position of Reform to that of the current government with respect to renewables. And given what may be the potential for a Reform government in future, or certainly more local government influence by Reform, those sorts of statements are going to be pretty concerning, not only for developers seeking to promote renewable development, but also for those who may be just a little bit concerned about climate change. Thanks, Charlie.
Thanks, Tora. I'm now going to deal with a appeal in Selby for expansion of a haulage company's premises for a outline application for storage distribution facility, HGV parking, and various ancillary uses, including a vehicle servicing workshop in Selby. The appeal was dismissed. It's fair to say that the inspector wasn't impressed by the scheme in a number of respects. It went down for a number of reasons, including landscape, heritage, best and most versatile land. I'm going to focus, given the time, because I'm very keen to hear from Chris on two aspects of the decision. And the first was flood risk. The inspector found that the scheme failed the flood risk sequential test, and that was a strong reason for refusal in 11D1 terms of the NPPF, so reason in itself for dismissing the appeal. The site was in flood zone 2 of risk of fluvial flooding, and therefore, notwithstanding the changes to the PPG in relation to sequential testing for surface water that viewers remember we discussed with Catherine Ventham last episode, because this was fluvial flooding, the provisions in relation to sequential test were largely unchanged. And the inspector didn't think the sequential test had been passed. There's a very lengthy passage that goes through the various shortcomings as she saw them in the sequential test. These included a lack of consultation with the council to determine the area of search, and the inspector considered that the area of search was far too narrow. She, in particular, it was a constraint to an area that encompassed a 5 to 10 minute drive from the appeal site, which, given the geographical catchment, both current and aspired for, of the haulage business, the inspector felt that was too small. She also commented that and importantly, the site shouldn't be used as the nucleus, as the centre point for the search area, because the site should be the product of the sequential search, not the starting point for it. Otherwise, essentially, the sequential test was biased. 5 of the sites considered in the sequential test had been built out already and were occupied, so it was somewhat odd, the inspector thought, that they were included there. I think there was a concern about a sort of straw man approach to the sequential test. there were some sites which had been discounted for reasons that the inspector considered to be poor. In particular, there was reference to the landowners not being willing to sell the land, but that hadn't been tested through evidence of discussions or negotiations with them. So for these and various other reasons, the inspector considered the sequential test hadn't been met. A salutary tale, I'd suggest that, as I said, that for non-surface water flood risk cases, the challenges of the sequential test highlighted in some cases like Mead haven't completely been resolved, so no scope for complacency in relation to non-surface water. And then there was a section related to active and sustainable modes of travel. Essentially, the inspector felt that with 180 employees using the site and the facility, your standard daytime hourly bus route wasn't good enough on its own to mean that this was a sustainable location for development of this nature. And specific regard to active modes of travel, findings of breach of local policy and indeed the framework, not just due to lack of sustainable transport modes, but lack of active travel modes in particular, something which, Chris, you'll doubtless be pleased to see taken into account, because often active travel modes are kind of swept up together with sustainable transport, but here was dealt with under a separate heading. So a step, no doubt you'd say, Chris, in the right direction, or indeed a pedal in the right direction, perhaps. And with that, I shall segue to you, Thea, for the interview.
Yeah, beautifully done.
Yes, I try my best. So, Thea, over to you to tell us a bit more about Chris and start the interview.
Thanks very much, Charlie. And Chris Boardman CBE, our first gold medalist on the show, as if you need any introduction. You were born in Merseyside. You rode in your first bike race, a time trial at the age of 13. You were on the national cycling team by the age of 16, and from then amassed a remarkable palmarès that included an Olympic gold medal, World Championship titles. You've worn both yellow and green at the Tour and secured a number of world records. But perhaps most impressively of all, you set the record on my local hill climb, the Burway, at the 1989 National Hill Climb
Right at the top, that one. That's right at the top, that one, yeah.
Yeah, well, I thought it would be. And you remain unbeaten. It was held on exactly the same course, our local hill climb competition this year, and the closest person, I think, was probably almost 10 seconds behind you, who came in. So that record still stands. You are working to promote walking and cycling all over the UK. You became Greater Manchester's Walking and Cycling Commissioner in 2017, and that expanded into the role of Greater Manchester's Transport Commissioner in 2021. And most recently, you were appointed as National Active Travel Commissioner in June 22 by the Transport Secretary. You are all... Chris, you're such a busy man. You are also...
Up to the end, it's fine. Just...
Bingo. Chair of Sport England. You were appointed to that in June 2021, and you are currently in your second term. So thank you so much for joining us. And before we get to the planning stuff, I'm really grateful to my teammates for allowing me the opportunity to interview you as a big cycling fan. And I get a chance to ask questions first, which are really for my own interest and anyone who's tuned in because they love cycling. And I would like to know from you, what was your journey into professional cycling? And did you always know, or at least from that first time trial, that you wanted to be a professional cyclist?
No, I didn't want to be a professional bike rider at all. I mean, it just looked really hard and scary and not something I particularly wanted to do. I mean, I started riding a bike probably the same reason everybody else did in my age group, which was just basically to explore, and then slightly later on to meet girls. And, it was a tool to do a job. And then it became my hobby with friends. And I had a cycling family, so it was really, I mean, I remember the event that you talked about, and people turned up in cut-off jeans and football shorts. Somebody held a watch and had a go, and then the results are posted on a lamppost to just a piece of A4 paper, and true to form at the time, my name was right down the bottom. But that was a starting point, and it was slowly shuffling forwards from there, really. But it was very unremarkable. It certainly wasn't any intention to be a professional sports person. I mean, I couldn't even win the sack race at the school sports day, to be honest. That was mostly won by Brian Gibson. He was sort of half boy or half pogo stick, but I've got over that now.
But you obviously had an enormous talent that developed and was recognised, and then you found yourself competing in cycling and winning an Olympic gold. And of all of your achievements on the bike, what stands out the most and why?
At the risk of being pedantic, just to double back to the first point, I didn't have an enormous talent. I was really ordinary. What I was good at and got fascinated by is how do you get a bit better, and how do you get a bit better, and how do you get a bit better? Why does that work that way? So it was more problem solving. And then over time, it just led to this place where you thought, oh, I think that's possible. What do we need? And it was more about puzzles and problems. And I just happened to be the topic of it for those few years. And in terms of disciplines, yeah, I mean, I think I like track racing. I like watching the track racing because it's very me. And I commentated it. I still do the job. I kept hold of it. All the stuff that you mentioned, I kept hold of the commentary work because it's good fun. And I did it last week for the World Track Cycling Championships, which is held in Chile, because it's very immediate. It's all in front of you. It's really noisy, and it's great. In terms of the cycling discipline for me, I just use a gravel bike now because my back gate, the Cairngorms, back gate opens into Abbey Forest, and just go out for 3 hours. And I just, the gravel bike's the most versatile thing, such a simple change for road bikes, just bigger tyres, and suddenly you've got much more territory that opens up.
Yeah, gravel biking's taking off massively, isn't it? It just makes so much more of the country accessible, I think, to more people, like e-bikes as well. Such a good way of encouraging people to get.
It's the equivalent of the 4x4 for people, really, who for the majority of people who will never go off tarmac in their life, but I really like the idea of it. And so gravel bikes is, you're like, oh, it's an adventure bike, but actually I'm just going to use it to go to work. But we like the idea of it, the potential that we could go down that track if we wanted to, and it's really caught people's imagination. It's just become by far the biggest selling bike at the moment.
And when you retired from professional cycling, I think that was in 2000, did you have an idea of what you wanted to do next? Had you been thinking about it in the run-up to retirement?
I still haven't worked it out now, to be honest. I've just, people say the word career, and I've never really related to it. I just keep bumping into interesting things and bluffing. And people seem to be going with it. And I keep thinking, can I have that? Can I have a go at that? And people go, yeah. And so it's just the scale of the problem solving is just escalated. It's got bigger and bigger, and it's got to a city region, and now it's a country in the world of sport and transport. It's just been. I've been very privileged to get the opportunity to interfere at a very large scale.
Interfere, I really like that. Interfere at a large scale. You've gone from city to nation. So next is world domination, Chris?
Could be, yeah, but one step at a time. I'll just take over this country first.
And how did you become so involved in active travel, and why is it important to you?
A mixture of Newsnight and Andy Burnham, I think it was probably the shortcut. So I was involved in British cycling before we won stuff, when our job was to turn up and clap. That was our role at major sporting events, was to fill the back rows. And we managed to turn that around. And in 2008, we became we were top 10 as a nation. The cycling team was top 10 as a nation in the Olympic medal tables. And I don't know if anybody's seen Mike Bassett, England manager, but it was kind of like that, really, where we're going, oh, we seem to be winning things. What do we do with this? It was an amazing time to be involved. And then we got to 2012, and we managed to keep it going for 4 years. And I found myself on Newsnight to talk about some of the successes. And it was the same time that the Greek financial crisis was going on, and I was wouldn't mind getting into that conversation as well, but I didn't have a tie, so I wasn't allowed. So they were asking about 2012, and then usually, as interviewers do, they sort of bolt on some other stuff and said, cyclist behaviour, don't you think they should have, don't you think they should pay road tax? And you think, well, there's no such thing. That was abolished in 1937. I was getting quite irritated by it, but the experience made me realise this machine is amazing. It is, and it was such a sturdy soapbox to stand on that I kept getting pushed forward for advocacy work more and more. And then I I bumped into Boris, and he was the first person to announce £1 billion being put in for sustained funding for transport. And I would imagine most people on this call, a lot of you are living in London, you'll see that network is built because all the local councils can invest. And while I was doing all that, Andy Burnham had just come out of Westminster, become the first Metro Mayor of Greater Manchester, and said, I'd like to do that for my region. Will you head it up? And so, yeah, it kind of started with Newsnight, really, but it certainly wasn't planned, and it still isn't planned. I mean, I just listened to some of the solar stuff and things, and all the things that I'm bumping into at the moment that become more and more interesting, linking up data centres with local swimming pools. This is something Sport England funds in Devon, to actually get cooling that you need and heating that you need, put that together. The pool gets 80 grand's worth of free heating every year. Oh, we've got 900 pools in England alone. What do we do with that? So I just keep bumping into interesting stuff, and I'm still bluffing.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to pass over to the other panelists to ask you their questions. And I think, Chris, we're starting with you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Thea. I just want to say I was listening to Bradley Wiggins talking about his new book, The Chain, the other day. I went to an event in Cheltenham where I lived, the Cheltenham Literature Festival, and he specifically mentioned you. Of all the cyclists, he specifically mentioned you as somebody who completely and utterly inspired him.
Well, he got me sucked back into the world of cycling, because I retired in 2000 and was just doing lots of other things. And I got a call from Dave Brailsford, Sir Dave Brailsford there, and he said, we've got this young athlete who's he's lost his way a bit. He's seconds and thirds, and he's almost there, and he's going to go off on a tangent and go and be a pro bike rider. Will you come and speak to him? And so the short story is that's what got me sucked back into the world of cycling. And it was great fun. But he was an interesting character, was Bradley.
Yeah, absolutely. And the book reveals all that. But you were absolutely his inspiration. So my question is, why is sustainable transport so important for the environment and climate change? And what are the practical things that people can do to make those changes?
Well, you've got a clash of a couple of things here. And as I mentioned at the very sturdy soapbox earlier, but if you think about this really simple tool, there is no big problem that we have that it doesn't speak to. Pollution, local pollution, non-emitting. Climate change, the problem that it's not fashionable at the moment. We've just skipped across that topic earlier. But climate change doesn't care, but it speaks to that. Health. You've got 1 in 6 people in the country dying of inactivity-related illness at the moment. It's more than smoking. You go, well, just build it into everybody's life, health, and affordable transport, access to work. So there's so many different reasons, but probably more important, and certainly more important to talk about first, is it makes life nicer. Yeah, ask anybody, where is the nicest place you last visited? And they will not describe to you, I went to this place that had amazing parking. They will describe a place to you where there were people interacting and doing things with their families, and I will guarantee you that there will be high levels of active travel around there. So it just makes life easier, nicer even.
Great, thank you very much.
Thanks, and Sasha, we're over to you then next.
Thanks, Thea. Chris, actually, I'm going to slightly segue, because one of the things that came to me, I mean, I do cycle a lot. I'm not very good, but I love it. And as I said, I did Lansdowne to John O'Groats. One of the problems is the hostility of the motorist. I mean, generally, across the 14 days we cycled, we probably got industrial language 2 or 3 times a day by people who just seem to be angered by the presence of cyclists on the road network. I mean, what's your view? How can people who are a bit tentative and uncertain about going on the road network, what approach can be taken to kind of deal with that fear?
Well, first of all, on the Land's End John O'Groats bit, I've not got round to that yet. And I think the main reason is I would have to spend a month doing it, and I want to stop at a pub every night. And I want to do the whole thing, not on roads, not least actually for the things that you're talking about. So I will get round to it. So next time you do it, if you come past my place, which you ultimately will, towards Inverness, then you can stop in for a beer. But putting put that to one side. I don't think we're not getting it wrong. We're just not getting it right yet. And there's two bits really, which is the wiring and the marketing behind the scenes. But the problems specifically that you're speaking to at the moment are more towards the marketing end of the spectrum. That we paint it as something that's in my way, and it's. I think we're seeing a general frustration of people. When I'm riding a bike in Scotland, it takes me a few days to get used to the changing culture, where people wait and people move around you, and there's a lot of different reasons that I think there's an association of. I do that as well. And I'm only going to have to wait for a few seconds. And when we're in the south of the country, when it's all very more intense and more dense, then that's just another frustration. And we forget to see it as a person, and we see it as an obstacle. And about 80%, the biggest barrier, 80% of people say safety is my biggest barrier. So you kind of got two choices, really. I mean, lowering speed actually makes a big difference to making it feel safer, and the other, of course, is segregation, and that latter is politically difficult at the moment. But if I can stretch this answer a little bit more, on the wiring front at the moment, what we say that we want, and that place that when I said earlier, describe the place that you'd like to live, the best place that you've been, and how we appraise spending at the moment. So our business case process, transport appraisal guidance, which is pretty geeky, but I'm probably in the right place for geeky conversations. They measure two different things. So this one is about we want livable neighbourhoods, we want our children to have independence, and that's the political outcome. And then we appraise the things the projects that we want to fund, and it's about journey time saved, and the health aspects are not properly reflected. So we need to do a bit of that. But more important than anything else is the marketing. And you mentioned it actually earlier when you were talking on other topics, consistent framing of the case. And we don't talk about we need people to be able to spend less time driving every day. Parents who give their kids a lift to school typically spend 12 full days a year driving, just doing the school run. When you add up that 10 minutes each way, twice a day, over the whole, it's 12 days a year. We need people freed from that. We need our children to have more independence and the ability, the freedom to stay at after school clubs. When we start framing things like that, more people go, that's the thing I care about. And when we focus on the activity, people go, cycling, yeah, that's not me. But if you talk about wanting to give your kids more freedom, you go, oh yeah, I want that. And so I think the framing, the marketing of what we do is really important, and that will bleed through to behaviour.
Thank you, Thea.
Thank you. And Paul, over to you for your question, please.
By all means, thank you, Thea, and thank you for coming on the show, Chris. Chris, I've got a question about your time in Manchester as the Active Travel Commissioner, which I'm going to ask in a minute. But one thing that I am really interested, one of our audience members has asked the question about whether electric bikes, particularly those that can travel up to 15 miles an hour plus, are actually an active hindrance in terms of people using cycleways. I don't know if you've got any thoughts about that.
Yeah, well, electric bikes, an electric bicycle is capped at 15.5 miles an hour. And if it can do more than that, then it's an electric motorbike. And at the moment, there are rules to deal with that. So the problem is actually enforcement. If you can sell product that can be chipped or modified to actually go faster than that, then you've got a trade-in standards issue. So it's actually, the e-bike is getting wrapped up in a bigger problem of illegal behaviour and not enough enforcement against that illegal behaviour. So that's a big issue, and particularly with delivery riders now. It is prevalent that you'll get multiple batteries, you'll buy unsafe units and things like that. The problem's actually tiny, but it makes quite good headlines. So of course, it's right out there. I think it's probably part of that cultural thing, but whenever we talk about this, I always have to separate yes, electric bikes do this, and they're an amazing game-changing thing. Again, in London, you saw what happened with Lime bikes around the tube strike. And the biggest threat to transport for London is not the loss of revenue for those few days. It's the fact that people tried travelling differently. And actually, that was quite good fun. And I've seen one of those bikes outside my office, and I think I might do that next time. So there's a tool for change, getting people to try different and taking away the fear. They're amazing. But that small threat there is constantly being weaponized in headlines. But it isn't a problem with electric bikes. It's a problem with the lack of enforcement, trading standards, and the package.
Thank you. My question was going to be, with your time as Active Travel Commissioner, when you're a Greater Manchester, if you'd been given the powers that Andy Burnham has, what would you have done differently? But muse on that, because I'm not going to take a second question.
Oh, go on, Paul.
How do you do all that? Give us a one sentence answer, Chris.
Well, Greater Manchester, I mean, what I learned with athletes, I learned to work in Greater Manchester. I learned how to do that in a wind tunnel with athletes, when we did all this amazing work to make athletes go faster and kept it really secret, took it to the athletes the last minute and went, right, do all of that, and then watch them qualify for the Olympics and watch 80% of them carry on doing what they were doing before. And I couldn't believe, we've just given you the recipe for success. The 20% of people who did everything that we wanted them to do were the ones that helped with the experiments. You have to bear with me with this one. So the penny dropped, really. I was very arrogant and rather ignorant at that point, probably still am. So we got all of the Olympic team one by one into the wind tunnel, didn't tell them anything, just projected information on the floor in front of them and let them play, because this belonged to them. Let them play, watch the numbers change. And then they asked for some advice, and the experts were there and gave them advice. Then they started to ask for suggestions, and the experts started to hand them pieces of clothing and equipment. And over the course of a couple of weeks, all of them changed. But the point with the wind tunnel was that this was their future. This is their choice, including whether to fail. They just needed information and they would choose which way. The performers didn't belong to us. So years later, when I went to work for Andy, it was really important that whatever came next, the local people, the local councillors owned it, because they would be owning it. So when I went to work for him, the three things that I needed to do was problem, prize, and pathway. What is the problem? And it was costing them 3.75 billion a year to travel as they were now, with congestion, pollution, collisions, £2 million, just over 2 million a week being spent treating inactivity, all those bills being paid locally. So that gave everybody the motivation to go, okay, yeah, I can see that problem. I'm now interested in looking for a solution. And then we looked at what would be needed to change things, packaged it in the framing that I mentioned earlier around, we want to make every pavement usable by a parent with a double buggy. We didn't talk about banning pavement parking. We talked about the outcome that more people could get it, and then created a pathway over 10 years to get there. And that's now 1,800 mile network, and it's being implemented, and we designed it in 6 months. In fact, 3 months for 60 grand. And that's now getting in. And that's why I ended up getting into wider transport, is how do we link this up with buses and trams and trains and integrated ticketing to make it a holistic offer. And it was a bloody great job, and I really miss it, because it was a cracking big puzzle. And people might have seen the B network, the big yellow buses. Well, if you look at the B, it's got little handlebars, because that's where it started. And then that's why I got asked to set up Active Travel England, to sort of take that regional example and scale it, which is proving slightly more problematic.
Oh, well, Manchester does things better. Thank you, Chris.
You're welcome.
Thanks so much. So, problem, prize, pathway.
That
sounds like life rules to live by.
Yeah, it works on a micro or a macro scale. What is the problem we're trying? We get so stuck into doing stuff and changing, and there's loads of change in government at the moment. Nobody stops to go, hang on a minute, define the problem that we're trying to solve. What is the size of the prize? So one is motivation. The other, this is the reason I am now committed to this. And then the pathway one is belief that it can be done. When you can see how I can get from here to there. If you take any politician to Copenhagen, they go, wow, this is amazing. But it's so disconnected, so far away from where we are. There's no pathway. I can't imagine the pathway. So it's a useless example for us. So those three things I find work out quite well.
Ladies and gentlemen, Chris Boardman, life coach. But we should go on to Charlie, because you have a question too.
Yeah, I do. I'm just interested in this comment in the comments about how Jersey and the Challenge, one of my favourite places in the world, where I'm actually going to this weekend, has a culture of motorists respecting pedestrians and cyclists, and I'm interested to know what the magic is there that we can transpose over here. But that's an interesting thought. But my question, Chris, is about Sport England and your current role there as their chair. And can you tell us a little bit more about how you see their role in the planning system, and in particular, how they can strike the balance between, on the one hand, facilitating new, much needed development and growth, but on the other hand, retaining the important things?
Well, you were, highly topical for this podcast, absolutely. And I am obviously not from the planning world. I sort of span delivery and politics. It seems to be the role I've fallen into. So when the statutory consultee review was announced earlier this year, and Sport England was named in it because, frankly, I think it would just made a nice pithy headline about a cricket ball. I went into it very open-minded and thought, well, what does this actually mean for the country? What does it mean for Sport England? Is it actually relevant? We all know we need more housing. So I went to look into it, and I found out that, in the 80s and 90s, the national planning policy at the time proved it simply didn't work. So we were losing, over a 20-year period, so the late 70s into the late 90s, we were losing 10,000 playing fields were lost in England. So the system didn't work. There wasn't enough local powers. There's too many pressures to build. And so in 96, Sport England was made a statutory consultee, and it did work. Now we now save about 1,000 playing fields a year, and they're almost always in the dense areas where they're needed the most. And I looked into, are we really a blocker? What do we need to do about this? And you'll know better than me. I think there's about 300,000 planning applications a year. So that meant that we were actually object to 0.001%. So I'm thinking, okay, I don't think we're actually a blocker here. And we're responding to over 99% of inquiries on time. So I looked at all that and I thought, okay, you really don't want to remove this backstop. But the politics of this, if statements have been made, then this has to be an evolution of, there can't be a case of, oh, we won't do that then, what next? So I think we need an evolution of what we do so that we see an awful lot less inquire, or we'll deal with an awful lot less in places we don't need to be. And that's, I hope, is the place that we're going to get through to this consultation, because we will all lose the places that we desperately need. And once it's gone, it's gone. So I'm really quite worried about that. Sport England is also Active Travel England. So I run two arm's length bodies, both statutory consultees. We have a scope of anything over 150 houses or 5 hectares. And we realised that second definition was taking in things like trading estates. And we thought, you know what, we better focus our small resource on the houses and not so much on that. And that was a good enough compromise that everybody seems comfortable. So we're finding our way through it at the moment. But I remain really concerned, because the plan that seems to be being proposed, I think we've disproved that in the 90s, and I really don't want us to go back there.
That's fascinating. Thank you very much.
Just on that, Chris, presumably you are going to present that evidence when the government consults on it, that you point out what did happen in the 80s and 90s, because that may not be at the forefront of their mind.
We will, and I think it's always a shame when people go out in front of a consultation with an outcome, and I think that's it's not great politics, frankly, and it can lead you to having to defend decisions which are not in the public interest. So I'm really hoping that we will be making that case. Lots of people who are in the industry, lots of the big sporting bodies have realised, oh, this is really bad, because local councils are under so much pressure to build that it will lead to things like them leasing out their own playing fields or allocating their own play, but it will happen. So I hope that case is both. We will make the case, and I hope it's heard. And I think we've already developed a really strong solution to offer up. So watch this space.
Brilliant. And Tora, finally over to you, last but not least.
Thanks, Thea. Chris, can I give a personal thanks to you for your theme this evening? Because I've very much enjoyed my...
You've done well there. I didn't say what I drink. I can't drink spirits, which I don't say that. They say it's like really bad form. But I'm Cairngorms IPA myself. I'm sure you'll get warmer and warmer as this podcast has got on.
Exactly that. Hopefully I can get my words out straight. Yeah, I mean, riffing really on what you were just saying, but I mean, in your view, how can the planning system and new development help encourage both sustainable travel and also protect and promote spaces for sports and activity? I mean, what would you like to see the planning system doing?
I think we need some joining up of what happens when we get to that. So when Active Travel India became a statutory quantity a couple of years ago, I asked the team to go and find me an example. That where, and so people get what we're trying to do, so we can paint that picture. And I was given a place just outside York called Derwentthorpe. I think it's called Derwentthorpe. Yeah, I think it is. And it was an eco development, and it was lovely. I looked at it, and it was really nice. And then I looked at its carbon footprint and the studies done afterwards, and actually higher than the surrounding. And I thought, that makes no sense. This is a really nice development. So I looked into it, and it wasn't joined up around it. If you just literally go and do a Google map search, you see like, this horrible 80s cycling infrastructure that stops, starts, disappears. The bus to get 2 miles to the town centre was 45 minutes, and there's nearly half an hour between them. So the only real choice that people have was to drive. Then the place wasn't built for driving because it was built to be sustainable, and so there's not enough parking for so it didn't join up. But if you do join it up, you can speed up house building, because this doesn't take as much space. Good provision for those shorter journeys and joined up to public transport, and you don't have to build that big flyover. You don't have to widen roads. And suddenly everybody's a winner. So it needs to be framed in that way. There's a small place just outside Ipswich called Kesgrave. 63% of kids, 900 kids, ride to school every day. I had to go see it because that's more than Holland. And they'd inherited a 1930s cycleway, built the estates up over the years around rather than over. And it's not pretty, but it's just the easiest way to get to school. And so it works. So that joining it up and asking the right questions about children's freedom and putting that kind of framing up front, I think, is what we need.
Brilliant. Thanks. Chris, I could speak to you all evening, but we don't have time for that. So I shall finish by saying thank you very much. And I do have an opening for a Tour Up TT partner next year, and I'm in Shropshire, so I'm not actually that far away from you. The invite's there, it's open. I'll leave it with you. Back to Charlie.
Thanks, Thea. Can I extend my thanks to you, Chris, on behalf of us all. Absolutely fascinating, and you're obviously doing some really important and valuable work, transformative. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
We're going to be back in 2 weeks' time on the 13th of November, where we're going to have the Labour peer, Lord Philip Hunt, who was Energy Minister both under Gordon Brown and under Keir Starmer, who's now a backbencher, and he and I have been working together on streamlining energy infrastructure consenting in the context of the Planning Bill. Thoroughly nice man, hugely experienced, and we're looking forward to speaking with him next week. Until then, have a lovely evening. I think you should go and pour yourself a second glass, Tora, and see you all soon. Thanks again, Chris.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.